Well, the problem I have with Brzezinski, for the most part, is that he's not only disingenuous, a polite word of calling somebody a liar, but he's essentially an opportunist. Okay, so he wants to paint things in a certain way when it comes to American foreign policy, but he doesn't give that same leeway to any other power which might be emerging. Which is, why he pivots his new book, on the both he calls China both threatening, and then at the same time he wants to co-opt China into the so-called free market system. So this is his idea. But I wanted to read you a very small excerpt from his book, The Grand Chessboard, pertaining to the European situation. So essentially what he's saying, and this book, mind you, was written, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So here it goes. Essentially in his book, I think this is page 30, I have it on my monitor here, page 60 of the Grand Chessboard, okay? The political momentum for Europe's unification was once driven by three main impulses: the memories of the destructive two world wars, which is true, the desire for economic recovery, and the insecurity generated by the Soviet threat. By the mid-90s, however, these impulses had faded. Economic recovery, by and large, has been achieved. If anything, the problem Europe increasingly faces is that of an excessively burdensome welfare system that is sapping its economic vitality. In other words, this guy is a neoliberal as well as a neocon. What he wants to do economically is to dismantle the welfare system in Europe, to favor the rich as opposed to those who aren't rich, who need a little help on the way. This is what his economic vision looks like, okay? And therefore, he's not going to support any kind of opposition to the dismantling of the social security net in Europe. He is against the social safety net in Europe. This is basically what he's saying. Okay. At the same time, all these proclamations that he is making in regards to fostering democracy and so on, either in Europe or elsewhere, they are basically a farce. Essentially, he is lamenting the fall of the regimes, or the threatened regimes, of dictatorial Saudi Arabia, all these regimes that are basically acting in the interest of U.S. foreign policy, which is based on energy needs. Okay, he doesn't admit that. No. And he also will not mention in his own book that when he mentions the rise of extremist factions, extremist Islamist factions and fundamentalism in the world, he never mentions his own role in actually getting these people into power. When in Afghanistan, he funneled money. His policies and prescriptions for policy essentially funneled money to the most extremist Islamic factions in that world. And he washes his hands of the whole thing and says, oh, well, now Islamic fundamentalism is a threat to Western Europe. Well, I wonder why. Especially when somebody like Brzezinski essentially funneled money to these very same people that he is now both supporting in some way, still in regards to Syria and so on. And on the other hand, it's all called a war on terror, which he is now rechanneling into a war on Russia. I mean, if this isn't just doublespeak, I simply don't know what is. Now, I'm assuming the national interests of Russia are of a large concern to this guy, and he isn't dismissing this in his book. But for some reason, he seems to think that by arming the pro-Western Ukrainian government, a non-elected government, by the way, brought about by essentially a U.S.-sponsored coup, it is somehow going to be conducive to peace in Europe. Now, it should be obvious to anyone living in Europe, including in the Ukraine, that this is not conducive to peace. None of this is conducive to peace. And, strangely enough, Kissinger, the perpetual warmonger, has essentially proposed the Finland model for Ukraine, saying that, look, Ukraine could have relations with both Western Europe, Western corporations, Western capitalism, as well as Russia. Well, of course, Kissinger would say that, and now Brzezinski is pushing that thing as well, besides his warmongering for the U.S. audience, to get behind some sort of fundamental opposition against Russia, when essentially we're talking about larger geopolitical interests here. And for some reason, Russia is not permitted to have their own geopolitical vision, The sad thing about all of this is that the Russian people are, the Ukrainian people are going to be screwed no matter who they side with, unless they do go with the Finnish model, where there is a peaceful cooperation between the Western-leaning Kiev, Russia, and the Eastern-leaning Russia, Ukraine. It can all work out. There doesn't have to be any war. But of course, all we hear in the United States and in most of all Western media is this warmongering, The problem here is that the people don't want a huge war. Nobody wants war. The people don't want war. The people want to get rid of corrupt leaders, and they're seeing them everywhere. And you're seeing this frustration played out both here in the United States, within Russia itself, and of course within the Ukraine. The problem within the Ukraine is that, the entire system is so corrupt that people really don't know. You're going to have to side with whoever is strongest where you live, because essentially when it comes down to violence, whether it's locally sponsored or sponsored from abroad, the ordinary citizen really doesn't have a choice. That's the problem for the ordinary Ukrainian, What we don't need to do here in the West, and as ordinary citizens in the West, is to fall for all this warmongering once again. We've already seen this whole ratcheting up of tensions, these ratcheting up of so-called diplomatic economic measures, these sanctions and stuff. We all know that these increasingly detrimental sanctions are a run-up to war. If the American populace cannot see this by now, you're being utterly misled. Of course there's propaganda on both sides. Of course, when you look at RT, the Russian television, state-sponsored television station, of course half of it is propaganda. But what do you think is happening on the American side, in the American media? This is also all propaganda. And it's all directed at you. I have to say one thing about the Russian people. At least when they were bombarded with state propaganda, state-sponsored propaganda, in, you know, as opposed to here in the West, corporate sponsored propaganda. At least they knew it was all propaganda, you know. They were cognizant of it, as opposed to us here in the West, uh, who can't discern propaganda for what it is. So yeah, I think Russia should have some leeway here. I think the demonization of Russia and Putin has gone too far. I don't think it's worth risking a thermonuclear war over. And if anything, you know, when Russian missiles were posited off the shore of the United States in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we came this close to nuclear war, global nuclear war. I don't want to see that happening again. And the West needs to pull back a bit from this encirclement of Russia via NATO. And if you want to read about what NATO is supposed to be doing in opposition to Russia, all you need to do is read the Grand Chessboard and this book, Strategic Vision by Brzezinski, to know what the U.S. foreign policy establishment is planning. It is not a good thing. Putin is no angel. Putin's government is no more democratic than ours. Democracy has all but vanished from the scene, as far as I'm concerned. But as long as we're dealing with nuclear powers, nuclear-armed states, I think we should de-escalate everything. It is not in the interests of the populations living anywhere to escalate any of this. Good night.